spreading around the globe. For those of you who don't know us, we are a non-profit organization based or aiming for the popularization of science through informal talks and discussions in such things as cafes or places like this. Most of our events are held in Czech, but today for the first time we will be having one event in English, so thank you all a lot for coming and hopefully you'll enjoy our presentations today. Today we will have two hosts. The first of them will be Professor Petr Pyšek from the Institute of Botany of the Czech Academy of Science and the Faculty of Science at the Charles University. At the Faculty of Science, Professor Pyšek has studied geobotany as well, and he became interested in the topic of biological invasions, which he'll be talking about today, during his internship at Oxford University. Later, here at the Academy of Sciences in the Czech Republic, he also founded the the Department of Invasion Ecology. For his work in the field of biological invasions, he has received several awards, such as the Czech Awards Neuron, Česká hlava, or the Alfred Wallace Award from the International Biogeography Society. Yes. Today he will be talking about invasions, mostly relating to plants. Before I give him the word, for those of you who are watching us on the stream, if you would like to ask questions, because at the end, after the two presentations conclude, we will have a time for discussion and you can ask questions. If you are watching on the stream and are not here or are here but are too shy, you can ask questions through the platform Slido, slide.do. Where if you input this event's code, you can just send messages here, which I can then read out. The code is written in the description under the stream at YouTube, but I will just read it out once. It's 1345899. So this is the code for those of you who want to ask questions from the stream. And now to our first host, Professor Pyšek.
Okay, thank you very much. It's nice to be here, and it took some time and negotiations with Pavel over the years to fit the terms and be here. And then when the opportunity arose with Dave Richardson visiting our department for a year, and then we saw that we could do it together, which is a great pleasure for me. And we divided the topics we are going to talk about in that I will try to give you like a more general big picture of plant invasions in the current world, and they will then focus on one region, South Africa, which is very special, as you will hear from the point of view of plant invasions. And I will. It doesn't work? Let's check. Yes. And I will start with a rather boring topic, which is definitions, and I divided the talk into several sections that will be introduced by titles. The titles are actually contest for old people. See if you can tell the name of the bands. And alien plants are plants that basically are introduced by humans to regions where they didn't occur naturally, where they didn't evolve. And you can say that in a region, alien plants are those that wouldn't occur there had not been for the role of humans. And depending on how successful the species following the introduction are, you can imagine the invasion process as an overcoming of different barriers, and depending on how far a species gets along these barriers, we distinguish three categories. The first is casual species that are sort of randomly present in the region, and they need to be reintroduced again because they don't occur, they don't reproduce in the nature, in the wild. Then it's a naturalized species, which is probably the most important category in terms of research, because most of the research and what we know has been done by analyzing the presence of naturalized species. And typical for naturalized species is that they form self-sustaining populations, they reproduce in the wild without the help of humans. And a subset of naturalized species are species that, that we call invasive, and they spread rapidly over large distances, often dominate the communities into which they are introduced. And if you look at the pictures at the top and at the bottom, it actually encompasses all the plant species from harmless poppies and knapweeds to some flagship invaders, at least in Central Europe and Czech Republic, like knotweeds and giant hogweed. And because we are at a science cafe, this picture actually illustrates one mechanism that is typical for biological invasions, and that's the fact that species often do better in the regions to which they were introduced than in the regions when they are native. This shows for Coffea arabica coffee, it shows the area where it is native. It is just this small area in southern Ethiopia and Sudan, and so the area where it is planted to which it was introduced is actually much larger. And the reason for it is that often plant species, when they are introduced, they leave their enemies behind. They are introduced without their pests and diseases. I will now show you several examples of spectacular invasions that can be found on all the continents. And first one is one of the most massive invasions in the history. This is Bromus tectorum cheatgrass, a grass that you can find also here. And during 40 years, when the railway was built in North America, this species invaded over 200,000 square kilometers of Eurasian, of American prairies. And the reason for this is that the settlers introduced not only the grass, and they also introduced cattle. And this invader was adapted to grazing by cattle, which was a feature that the native species in the prairies didn't have. So this together, like this interaction, resulted in this huge change. And if you look at how the landscape looks when it's invaded by cheatgrass, it's very different from original picture of a California prairie. Another example is from the southwestern United States. It's several species of tamarisk, salt cedar, that were introduced from Asia and also invaded large areas of land in 23 states. There was estimate of huge economic loss calculated for the species. And the main impact was also that they increased the soil salinity, and actually people who were living in the area had to leave their agricultural production. And again, if you look at this, and this is the natural vegetation willow poplar forest that were replaced by this invasion. The last example, this is from Africa, Congo, and the species is called Pueraria montana, kudzu vine, that invades in many parts of the world, and this is how it looks when it takes over the vegetation. You can burn it, and it usually comes back. Several other examples of like flagship plant invaders, well-known water hyacinth, gorse in New Zealand, and here Himalayan balsam, and already mentioned giant hogweed, major invaders with us. Some examples are so spectacular that I didn't resist and borrow it from the animal invasions. This is something that often appears in the media. And it relates to the greatest actually biggest invasion organism in the world, probably, not counting clonal plants. And the story goes that the infamous Colombian narco baron Pablo Escobar had 3 females and 1 male of hippos brought to his private zoo, and when he was shot in 1983, they were left in a pond. And during 30 years, they escaped from the zoo and invaded at the spread of 2,000 kilometers across the section, and it was estimated that there were about 100 animals, and the prediction for next 15 years was devastating, 1,400 animals. And you can imagine, everybody knows hippo, what it does to a river in terms of pollution, change of water quality, nutrients, and so on. Interestingly, last week it appeared that the estimate from 2020 was corrected, and it appears that even right now there are actually twice as many hippos than predicted by the first paper. And this brings me to the quote I borrowed for the title of my talk from Stephen King, from one of his novels, because you don't want to find hippo in your garden pool. That's obvious, and that's very unlikely. But you also don't want to find a plant like this, which happened to us during our recent research in Kruger Park in South Africa, when the kudzu vine I showed before was first recorded last year. With the first record, if you know what you have, you can eradicate it and go on. But it's really some plant species you don't want to find in your backyard or in your area. Now, the dynamics of plant invasions or biological invasions in general is accelerating during the last 200 years and doesn't show any signs of slowing down. What you see here are plots for individual groups of organisms, for plants, vertebrate, invertebrates, and you see the number of the first records of species that later become naturalized, and you see they are increasing almost in every figure. And this pattern is very, very consistent and obvious, and it holds for all continents. The colors here for those groups refer to different continents, and on all scales. Continental, this is plants in Europe, and this is plants in Czech Republic. So it's really increasing. And if we look at plants in detail, we see very steep increase in the 19th century, which can be attributed to the increased interest in plant hunting, in horticulture, also increased transport possibilities. This facility here, this small glasshouse called Vordyan case, and allowed to bring people plants in good conditions. And also it was establishment of botanical gardens to bring plants, and so-called acclimatization societies that were founded in regions that were colonized to favor and to facilitate the introductions of plants. This last example is how it looks at the local scale. This is giant hogweed, Heracleum mantegatianum, in the Slavkovsky forest, the region where it was first introduced. And these small white dots are individual flower heads, individual umbels. This is how it looks in 1962, and this is how it looks 30 years later, the same place. So you see that it's really remarkable dynamics. If you are alien plants, you have great possibilities because the world is connected. Places on the earth are much more easier to get, and you have a lot of possibilities. So really, they are widely distributed, and we will now look how we know. There is a lot of books and papers in journals and the literature. So we have quite a good idea these days how naturalized plants are distributed over the globe. And it's not only science. Biological invasions made its footprint in pop culture. This is the song by the rock British band Genesis, and they actually in the year 1971, when the scientists didn't really pay attention to invasive plants. It was 13 years after the publication of a book that is considered the foundation of invasion ecology. And they, in this record, The Return of Giant Hogweed, they very precisely described the introduction of the species into Kew Gardens and how it spread over UK. So there is an inspiration from biological invasions to rock music, and it's also vice versa, because sometimes the titles of the songs very nicely fit to the content of the papers. Let's go back to numbers, to science. From this study, from this database, which is called GLONAF, and that covers almost the whole world, we know that there are about 14,000 plant species that are naturalized somewhere in the world. It's about 4% of the world flora, which doesn't seem much, but it's enough if you consider the impact that these species can have. Looking at the world regions, North America harbors the highest number of naturalized species, followed by Europe. But if you consider the size of individual continents, then the situation is worst in Australia and New Zealand. And Pacific Islands are also heavily affected, and this is related to the fact that islands are generally vulnerable to invasion due to their special biota that evolved in isolation and have and are not really good in resisting invasions, and also from island you cannot easily move away if your land is being taken by an intruder. Also, another interesting thing is that the continents on the northern hemisphere are more often donating species to the south, which is something that already Charles Darwin noticed. And it's because species on the northern hemisphere have larger distribution ranges, which means that they encounter more species in competition and in species interactions. So they learn, they are more experienced, and then when they were introduced to the south, this could be an advantage. We can also delimit the hotspots of naturalized invasions these days, which is, as you can see here, both coasts of North America, northwestern Europe, South Africa, as we will hear, and New Zealand and the Pacific region in general. These funny shapes at the bottom are due to the fact that the figure expressed what is the level, what is the number of naturalized species for a given country related to its size. So species that are richer than countries that are richer in naturalized species that would correspond to their size are inflated, and those that are poorer in species are shrinked. And I talked about naturalized species, so just to know that we have about 14,000 now. It's maybe more because the database is living and is being updated. So maybe these days it's like 15,000, 16,000 species. And there is information about 3,000 invasive species, those that spread fast and cause problems. We have an idea about how Europe is invaded, how individual parts of Europe differ. This figure that is based on mapping the invasions within habitats shows that the most invaded are lowlands in the Western Europe and agriculture regions in the Eastern and Central Europe, and least invaded is the Boreal zone, mountain ranges, so generally area that are less warm, and also parts of the Mediterranean area. Now let's look how the situation is in the Czech Republic. Generally, we can say that it basically corresponds to the environmental settings and human pressures to the countries with similar settings. We have a good information about Czech alien flora because in 2002 we started we produced a like a detailed and thorough checklist and catalog of alien plants in the Czech Republic, and every 10 years we manage to update it. So the last edition, the last paper, is from the very end of the last year. And it appeared that we have over 1,500 alien species, of which over 400 are naturalized and about 80 are invasive. And this figure actually shows two groups that are distinguished in European invasions. So-called archaeophytes, as the name indicates, came earlier from the end of the Neolithic period till the end of medieval, and neophytes are the modern invaders that arrived in the last 500 years. The Czech native flora contains over 2,200 species, which means that the percentage contribution of naturalized species, so species that are permanent part of the flora, is about 16%. We consider all alien species, including casuals, it's more than 1/3. And this also shows that in the 3 editions of the catalog gradually how the number of species recorded increased, which is of course due to new introductions, which are very precisely and very well recorded by the botanical community here, but it also reflects the increasing knowledge and things associated with research. Also in herbaria, and sometimes you can find a new plant that you didn't know about and it was introduced 200 years ago. And this is the figure we've already seen, the increase in all categories of alien plants over the last 300 years. This is how invasions look if we plot them on the area of the Czech Republic. We see that this is based on invasive species only, and we see that it is areas around big cities and warm lowlands and areas disturbed by mining activities that are most invaded. And we can also look at the different groups in detail, like according to stage invasion or the time of introduction. And you see that basically the pattern is quite consistent for these different groups. If you are interested in this in detail, this is a place to go. It's a Pladias database of the Czech flora and vegetation that actually summarizes all the available information on the Czech flora and vegetation. Now, why some species are successful and others are not? Here, it's very complex, and the outcome of invasion depends on the interaction of many factors, including species, traits, and socioeconomic and habitats, propagule pressure, and residence time. Propagule pressure is a term that we use for how many seeds or any part that can give birth to a new plant are being introduced into the system, and it relates to the activity of people, of course. The factors differ between mainland and island. Here, this figure actually indicates that for mainland, climate is important, and the socioeconomic status of the region is important, and also geography, because New World is more invaded than Old World due to historical regions, because the cradle of invasions is in the Old World, and areas of the New World were more prone to invasion. It's very different on islands, where the main factor, the most important factor, is the degree of isolation. And here it appears that islands that are more isolated are easier to be invaded, and then the altitudinal heterogeneity, which actually reflects the habitat offer. How many habitat heterogeneity, and geography, as we already mentioned, the islands on the southern hemisphere are the most affected ecosystem on the planet. Looking at the economy, if you look at the picture here, the blue regions are countries or regions with the highest income, and they very well correspond with the red color here, which is regions with the highest numbers of naturalized species. If we look at it quantitatively, indeed appear that it's human population density and what was here expressed as national wealth, but it's you can use other economic factors that are the most important key drivers for European invasions, not only plants, but also several groups of animals. Horticulture, planting is the main pathway of alien invasions. And here you see that botanical gardens grow about 50% of the world flora and almost all naturalized species of the world. And even in private collections, 60% of naturalized species are grown, which this is a massive pressure and massive opportunities for spread of these species. And associated with this is also one interesting conflict of interest, and it's that gardeners love the plants that have exactly the same features that make them good invaders. If they grow rapidly, they can grow in a range of conditions, they reproduce well. And British Horticultural Society gives this award for a plant of the year for 100 years since 1922. And of the 574 species that were given this award, 56% are invasive somewhere in the world. And it goes even deeper to the history. Japanese knotweed, a flagship invader here, was also given a gold medal, but as early as 1847. So this is really a problem and massive pressure favoring helping invasions. Traits, the characteristics of species, the traits are important and play a role. And if we compare, it's interesting that if you compare species, how they do, what are the traits, how they grow, how many seeds they have, how big are the populations. And if you compare how they do in the native range and how they do following the introduction, so on average, really in the new range, the invasive individuals are bigger, they are more fecund, produce more seed, and they are more abundant, the populations are bigger. What is interesting that about a half of the species tested in this paper are, and this was paper on really remarkable major invaders from the IUCN database. And half of these species is very extremely successful invaders just by doing the same thing as they do at home, which is interesting, or which is important from the management point of view, because if you have a species that is doing better, there is a reason why it's doing better. So you can try to stop him from doing better by introducing an enemy or whatever. If the species is just doing the same thing, it's very difficult because you cannot do anything with him. Habitats are extremely important. They explain large proportion of variation, and this picture actually shows, it illustrates that it really matters in which habitat the alien species are introduced. You see big differences between individual habitats, with, of course, the habitats that are most disturbed, like rural vegetation, arborland, are most invaded. Invasions do not happen alone. They interact with other processes of global change, and climate change is one of them. This is a classical study from 15 years ago, and colleagues in Switzerland showed that this small palm, Trachycarpus fortunei, that grows in evergreen forests at the foothills of the Swiss Alps, and it was gradually making its way into this forest, in the forest understory. And each stage that is displayed here, like seeds freely, then small palms in the help layer, then in shrub layer, growing taller, and then starting to reproduce, can be related to the increase in temperatures. Another important thing with relation to climate change is the prediction how plants can do when the climate changes. So this paper shows for species that are grown in European gardens and they are not reported to escape, they are not found in the wild, and it shows for 3 different climate change scenarios differing in the assumed increase in temperature. what will be the area that is potentially suitable, and what is the probability that they will escape. And you see the red dots here, that for the majority or for many species, the opportunities will become more suitable than they are today. The blue dots here indicate that some species will also lose. So some will lose, some will gain, but overall the threat from invasion is likely to increase. What's the impact? Why do we bother? What the invasive species do? They do a lot of things, and I will here focus just briefly on the sort of most obvious. We've actually saw on those examples that they can do changes to the whole ecosystems and ecosystem functioning, and I will focus here on the impact on species richness. One example here shows that if you look at the IUCN categories and look at the species that are threatened by invasive plant, it's about 500 plant species globally. And if you go to local scale, where you also can have species that are extinct from a particular country, not necessarily meaning that they are extinct globally, the figures are actually much bigger, with 1,400 for South Africa alone. Going one step further, extinctions. A study a few years ago showed that on the IUCN red list, the plants and animals that went extinct, and the implication was, and the invasive species were implicated in this extinction, that this holds for a quarter, 25% of plants and 33% of animals, and it's really the major factor, more important than hunting, harvesting, and agriculture. And this table shows examples of some really devastating effect of animal invaders. If you look at in detail, it's of course in famous cats that caused the extinction of many species of birds, mammals, and reptiles on islands worldwide. Very well-known example is Nile perch, one fish species that was introduced into Victoria Lake in Tanzania and caused extinction of 200 endemic species of fish. The Guam Island has a special invader, the brown tree snake, also responsible for extinction of many other species. And even snails have their representative. This species, interestingly, was introduced to Hawaii to control another snail species, and this is how it went. In fact, maybe the most devastating are diseases caused by fungi. This is one example is amphibian chytrid fungus that decimates amphibian species globally, with nine extinct and over 400 threatened. And then this fungus that causes the well-known white nose syndrome, and it's a European gift to America, causing 10 million dead bats. And these figures are a few years old, so they are probably now much worse. One effect of this changes in distribution is what we call biotic homogenization. And the figure on the left is the relationship between the similarity of regions and their distance. So regions that are far from each other, if you only consider native ranges, so that's how evolution made it. So the distance regions are very dissimilar to each other. And if you consider the same species with their current ranges, meaning that many of them have larger ranges due to introduction by humans, the relationship is almost lost. And this figure actually shows how, again, native ranges here, how the snail faunas of the world are distinct and separated into groups based on environmental conditions and evolutionary history. And today, again, if you consider the introduced ranges, the pattern is just the only difference is between temperate versus tropical and subtropical regions. So the pattern is lost, and that's why we call it the breakdown of biogeographical barriers. What can we do? we we need, of course, we need like effort on site with managers that work in the field. But more important is that we need coordinated efforts at the global scale that go to policy. And I don't believe this is what Pavel created as a logo for this promotion of this talk. I actually don't believe it would ever come here. I don't think we are even here. But still, we need to do something. Biological invasions are perceived as a problem for a very long time. This is the effort that was called Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and it shows that invasive species actually present threat to biodiversity in the majority of habitats. Some threats are really severe. One important activity was the report of the International Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services a few years ago, where invasions were listed as one of the main biodiversity threat, together with some other, like changes in land use, the direct exploitation, climate change, and pollution. So this was really important also for PR. We have this guy, Bill Ripple from Oregon State University a few years ago. He started a series of papers that focus on the most pressing environmental issues, including biological invasions, and it's actually a reflection of the well-known scientist warning to humanity in 1992, where the group of prominent scientists warned that human is on collision with the planet well-being, and concluded that after 25 years it didn't really improve. And the main thing that now resonates in the invasion community is another report of the IPBS panel, and that's the report on assessment of alien invasive species. And the report will be launched in September of this year. So this is really a major thing that will bring together all available information, and it will gain a lot of publicity, which is something that IPBES has its ways how to promote it. So with this, I thank you for your attention. It's a result of the quiz. And last short note, this guy, Vojta Jarošík, who sadly passed away 10 years ago, and it will be 10 years this week, so that's why I would like to remember him, because he also made a great contribution to invasion biology and to ecology in general. Thank you very much.
So thank you to Professor Pyšek for his talk, and now I would like to introduce our second speaker, which will be Professor David Mark Richardson, who works at the Center of Invasion Biology at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, and who is visiting now the Czech Republic, and we use this opportunity to invite him here. Professor Richardson is mainly studying invasive trees and shrubs, and so he has studied forestry at Stellenbosch University and botany at the University of Cape Town, and later went on to found or to be the director of the Center of Invasion Biology at Stellenbosch University, where he also serves as the deputy director. Today he will be talking about invasive plant species in relation to his own native, South Africa, I assume. So, thank you.
Right, many thanks. It's nice to be here, and many thanks to Petr for the nice introduction. I don't need to explain to you any of the background anymore. So I'm going to be speaking about invasions in South Africa, where I come from, and where I've done most of my research. So as Petr has explained really nicely, invasions are a worldwide phenomenon. But every area is unique in terms of the species that we have, of the impacts, and so on. But the theme of my talk is that every part of the world is unique when it comes to innovations in terms of which species they export to other areas and which species they accept from other parts of the world. So, as we've seen already from Petr, a really central thing in invasions is opportunities to exchange, and there have been many of these in history. A few examples are the Columbian exchange as a result of European exploration and the colonization of many parts of the world. Another example is the British Empire, where the Britain had various colonies around the world, with which for more than 100 years they exported goods and commodities. Another really important thing for us to think about when looking at the exportation and the importation of species is the environment and the evolutionary history, as these influence the extent to which various parts of the world function as sources or as sink of introduced and naturalized and invasive species. As Petr has already said, the world is connected, and if we're interested in plant invasions, these are a few of the really central things that move species around the world. Horticulture, ornamental horticulture, commercial forestry, agroforestry, which is the use of plants with trees in some form of agriculture. Restoration. In many parts of the world, non-native species are introduced in an attempt to repair, restore ecosystems, and more in the Anthropocene, plants are being used to produce biofuels, and this is something that is already causing a lot of issues around the world, and will do a lot more in the future. So, South Africa, at the southern tip of Africa, really interesting place for all sorts of reasons. One of the world's 17 mega diverse countries, more than 23,000 species of native plants. 60% are found only there and nowhere else. So 10% of the world's flora, native flora, is in South Africa, which occupies roughly 1% of the Earth's land area. It's also interesting because of the diversity of habitats, which is reflected by the diversity of its major biomes. So these are major terrestrial biomes of South Africa. I'd just like to flip through a few of them. We have the fynbos biome, which is a Mediterranean type shrubland in the southwest. We have the succulent karoo biome, which is the world's richest by far succulent plant flora. We have a biome called the Nama karoo, which is an arid, short shrubland with many grasses. Many people think of Africa as a savanna. We have arid savannas. We have mesic savannas. We have a large area of grassland. And we have some other biomes. We have the biome called the Albany Thicket. We have an Indian Ocean coastal belt. And important for this talk is that we only have a really small area of native forest. The largest area of native forest occurs here, and there are a few patches elsewhere that are even too small to show up on this map. And it will emerge later why I say this is quite important. So there's a lot of South Africa out there in the world. This is a study that we did with Petr and others a long time ago, almost 30 years ago, where we had a look at the biomes of South Africa and where they were found in other parts of the world. And we see a large part of the temperate world has areas that are environmentally really similar to South Africa. And we followed this up. We looked at the trade and tourism links, and these are indicated. The thickness of the arrows and the darkness of the arrows indicates the extent of these links, and the numbers show the number of South African plant species that are recorded as invasive in other parts of the world, and we'll expand on this later. So South Africa has many famous and infamous people. I'm sure some of you will know some of these people, depending on your interest, if you're interested in sport or politics or movies or music or this nutcase, which is also a South African by birth. And South Africa also is famous for other things, for other exports, other things that we've exported to other parts of the world, for which we are famous or infamous. And these are some of the most important invasive plants around the world that have at least part of their native range in South Africa. I established a project in the citizen science the platform called iNaturalist, and I've called this South Africa's diaspora Flora, and it lists 79 species of the plants which have a part of their native range in South Africa, and it looks at where else in the world these plants are found. So it's a huge area. So South Africa, like most other parts of the world, is extending their influence in worldwide. So South African human beings have also done remarkable things. And for a small country, we have a reasonable number of Nobel Prize winners in fields ranging from the Peace Prize to medicine to literature. So we're very proud of our Nobel Prize winners. Unfortunately, our other organisms in South Africa also win awards, but not necessarily the positive awards like the Nobel Prize. So all of these species of South African species, which are on some other list around the world of the world's worst invasive species, or the world's worst 50 invasive species or something. Okay, notably, there are a few things that our exports where we really excel. We export grasses to many parts of the world. These are South African species of grasses which are major invaders in other parts of the world, and I don't think many of these species are actually invasive in Central Europe. So you might not know these species, but we'll get onto that in a while. Another group of organisms where we excel with our exports are bulbs, irises and their allies, Watsonias and Gladiolus, Ixia. Many of these species that are well known in ornamental horticulture have their origins in South Africa. Many of them have been hybridized to produce things. So these these are native South African species that are invasive around the world, and the worst problems of our species are in Australia and New Zealand, where irises from South Africa regularly feature in the worst list of the worst invaders. So I'm interested in the idea of certain parts of the world acting as factories. The evolutionary and ecological history of certain areas have conspired, as it were, to build and construct species that are well equipped to become major invasives. And I'd like to focus on these two groups, the grasses and the bulbs. So for grasses, South Africa is well known for its large fauna, mammalian fauna, many species of antelopes and other browsing herbivores, and these animals, this fauna has been there for a really long time and has influenced the evolution of our biota in many ways, as has the occurrence of regular, intense fires, and the combined influence of long-term, heavy, sustained, large mammal herbivory and regular fires has built a group of grasses that are superbly equipped to perform as amazing invaders, and have done so in South America, North America, and Australia in particular. So similarly with bulbs, our large flora of Iridaceae and other taxa has evolved with the specialized flora of fossorial mammals and a wide range of insect fauna with which these species have evolved to explore very particular niches that have stood them in really good stead. So our grasses are amongst the poster child of invasive species around the world. This is a species called gamba grass. It occurs not only in South Africa but also up into Central Africa. It was introduced into Australia to improve their natural pastures. It was a really bad idea. It forms this massive fuel bed that transforms ecosystems. You get much more intense fires that removes over 1 or 2 fire cycles the whole tree layer. Amongst the many species of Iridaceae, of the bulbs from South Africa that have been moved around for ornamental horticulture, this species has probably been the most invasive, and it forms whole fields full of monocultures that crowds out everything else in some parts of Australia. So much for the give. So I've explained really briefly and superficially how I think our ecosystems have created these good invaders. But how about the species that we have received. So a few years ago, we produced this book. If you're interested, it's available for free downloading. It's an encyclopedia of everything that you wanted to know, but were too shy to ask about invasions in South Africa. It records about 750 species of naturalized plants, of which almost a third, this is extraordinary, are trees. Wow, this is wow. There's nowhere else in the world where the invasive flora is made up largely or to a very large extent of trees. In most parts of the world, it's grasses and herbaceous things. In one of my recent papers, I call South Africa the world capital of tree invasions. Recently, I was involved in compiling a worldwide database of invasive trees, and we came up with a list of over 400 species of trees that are invasive somewhere in the world. Almost a third of these species are invasive in South Africa, but only 3% of them are native to South Africa. So there is clearly a huge imbalance here, and I will flash up that slide again. Wow! So so this makes South Africa really unique and the best place in the world to study invasions of trees, which until recently many people would not have equated trees with invaders. So how did we get these trees? As I said before, South Africa was part of the British Empire, and in the 1800s, in the British rule, we received introductions of trees, hundreds, more than a few thousand. But these were the dominant ones. Pines from Europe and North America, eucalyptus from Australia, acacia from Australia. And these just show the number of species that were introduced in each decade. So for eucalyptus, we introduced well over 100 species. Of the pines, almost 100 species. And acacia also up to 100. As I said, this was all done as part of the British Empire Forestry Institute's initiation. So these introductions, most of which were made more than 100 years ago, have led to massive land-altering invasions. So we have pine trees. This is Pinus pinasta from Europe, which has invaded tens of thousands of hectares of the mountain area. Acacia, this is Acacia mearnsii. All the rivers in South Africa, almost all the rivers are choked with invaders, and this is Eucalyptus camaldulensis, also occurring along rivers. So pines are something that have featured in my research for a long time. But plantations like this one of Pinus radiata from California were planted in areas that were naturally short shrublands, and they immediately began to spread into the fynbos. And this aerial photograph just shows near Stellenbosch a plantation that was established in 1938, and all of this is natural fynbos, Mediterranean type shrubland. In 1981, this whole area was invaded by the pine trees, and in later years it became an impenetrable forest. And this has happened over many tens of thousands of hectares, with the result that we have widespread invasions of many pine species in many parts of South Africa. Acacia, which is an amazing genus of more than 1,000 trees and shrubs from Australia, was introduced at about the same time and has done the same thing. They've just, wherever they've been planted, they've invaded rivers and shrublands that they were widely planted along the coast to stabilize sand dunes, and now they form impenetrable stands. And this is the example of naturalized records of acacia in South Africa, almost everywhere along the coast, not so much in the interior. And this is one species, Acacia mearnsii, which is by far the worst. For acacias and for the other groups, the purpose of the introduction has shaped how these species have performed in the landscape and the extent of their invasion. If we have a look at all of the species of acacia that are listed as invaders, and have a look at the extent of the area that they've occupied, we see that the species that have occupied by far the largest areas are those that were introduced for forestry or for dune stabilization. So, and this form of introduction resulted in massive plantings over large areas, creating massive propagular pressure and large areas of opportunity for invasion. Species introduced as ornamental plants were planted in much smaller numbers in isolated foci, and have had less opportunity to become invasive, and hence have occupied a much smaller areas. And the same applies for eucalyptus. We see, if we have a look at the number, just as a really crude measure, the number of the plantations for each of these species, and have a look at the number of records in the herbarium of naturalized populations, we see a positive relationship. How about impact? So a few years ago, we did a review of all published records of impacts of all invasive species. We found 123 publications that quantified impacts of invasive species, and 71 species were mentioned in these publications. By far, the most studied impacts were those of trees, and this reflects the importance of this type of invasion in South African landscapes. So as you can imagine, replacing a shrubland with tree vegetation has changed hydrological processes, has deleted groundwater, has added huge amounts of biomass to these ecosystems, and these have had huge impacts on ecosystems in many parts of South Africa. How do we deal with this? Over the last 30 years, the biggest intervention has been in the form of a huge program called Working for Water. Working for Water was established in 1995 with the aim of reducing the impact of invasive trees and shrubs on water production. So this diagram just shows the effect of tree cover on the flow from rivers, and South Africa is an arid country, so the impact of these invasions on the resource has been really important. So Working for Water involves employing unskilled people with the idea of providing employment and developing a skill base, and at the same time to reduce this huge environmental problem. And the red shading here just shows now, just a year ago or so, where these Working for Water projects are located. And over the years, there's been systematically more planning to prioritize areas based on things such as strategic water resource areas, protected areas, and threatened ecosystems. So these are programs of focused in important areas for all these reasons. How do we manage this? There's a lot of work going on to develop national strategies for various groups of species, for instance, for the prosopis, for acacias. There's a large and really effective program of biological control, introducing insects and fungi from the native range of these species to help reducing their fecundity and extent. There's a lot of work going on to involve the public and citizen groups. Legislation is in place and is being effectively used to ensure that this problem is addressed. And there's also all the management is structured around risk assessment. So it's much more of a systematic approach. So I'm at the end of my talk. So I hope that you found it interesting to have a look at some ideas about how certain areas act as factories, and others as source areas, and how insights on these ideas can inform us and help us manage the pathways of introduction, and hopefully reduce the problems into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Professor Richardson. And now I would like to invite both of the speakers here in the front, and it's time for questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and my colleague will give you a microphone so that the people on the stream can also hear you. Does anybody here have a question now? If not, I have the first question from Slido. and that I think this is for both of the guests. If you face the same problems as people who study global climate change, and if there are people that would deny that biological invasions are a serious issue?
It happens, I think it happens in every field of science, that you have people who deny what science has came with. And for biological invasions, there is a, I would say, quite strong way of thinking that denies invasions. And there's a lot of debate in the literature and the discussion. But overall, it's also because of how media pick up the stories, pick up the information. Because everything that is new, if the mainstream is that we have invasions are a problem, and we need to do something about it. And then if someone comes and says it's nonsense and we don't have to do that, and all plants are the same and we should embrace new ecosystems, that's something that attracts media attention because it's controversial.
Yeah, I think there are various categories of denial or contrary views, as Petr says. I would say that the number of, if we forget just for a moment the nutcases out there, because there'll always be nutcases, but the number of serious objections to working on invasive species is reducing, because I think the impacts are becoming so obvious worldwide. What there's also a lot of debate from the public about is whether, for instance, in South Africa, just to use an example, we have this massive problem of tree invasion. So over the last century, and in particular the last 50 years, a lot of shrublands and grasslands have been converted from shrublands and grasslands to forest. And many of the control operations are trying to take them back to their original shrubland or the grassland state. And some people often say, how can you saw down trees when trees are so good in combating climate change? So it's becoming sort of a conflict of interest, but because these invasive species obviously have a huge impact on biodiversity. How do you address the biodiversity impacts versus some potential positive benefit to carbon sequestration?
Thank you. Any questions here? Mm-hmm.
I would like to ask about horticultural invasions, because if I am correct, it's still the most important pathway for plants. How to prevent from this pathway of invasion, because people still want to try new stuff, new plants, and it's really difficult to find some restriction for this, because nowadays we have these permanent flower beds, ornamental bambuses, and so on. So what to plant to prevent, or what to do to prevent these kind of invasions?
Yeah.
If there is some solution for this.
Maybe I could just say in South Africa there's a lot of work going on that, and a solution that seems to be working quite well is that the horticultural organizations have agreed to adopt a certification. So their nurseries can be certified as green if they undertake not to sell any species that are known to be invasive. So there's a green listing, and then they become more favorable to the public. That's one way.
I would say that actually the general principle that everything that is against a free trade is extremely difficult to get to incorporate into legislation. So this is one way: the lists and border control, and not allowing some species to come to the country. But I don't think this can change. This can change much. And the main thing, and it always comes down to education and people awareness and collaboration with other resorts like gardeners, horticulturists, landscape architects, and try to educate people in that they understand that it's better to use native species in their garden. And but it's a really very difficult and long way to go. And
there are also some technological solutions whereby sterility can be achieved through breeding, and there is some evidence that there has been some success in that for some species. That's more likely to succeed for small herbaceous things than for trees, where it's much more difficult to.
The problem is this is never absolute, so you always have some leaking, and it's difficult, as we know. It's another actually aspect is that horticulturists need to find plants that are adapted to climate change, which brings about, again, as I was talking about, this conflict of interest. They are bringing and trying to find plants that will do well in the changing conditions. So it's actually the red-green race.
In South Africa, we have a category of invasive plants. They are known as Category 3. These are species of horticultural importance, and you can get a permit to maintain these on your land, but you're not allowed to sell the plants or to move them anywhere else. And the thought behind that is that this is more successful than alienating all the landowners and the horticulturists, and over time, other plants that are less invasive will be found, will be brought into the markets, and will become popular.
Other questions here in the audience? If not, I would like to have ask about when there was the map of species introduced to the world from South Africa. I saw, if I'm not mistaken, that the Czech Republic was also in the areas affected. And if any of you know which species they are, so that we can be on the lookout for them.
Do you have Oxalis pescapri?
No, it's the other way. Species introduced to South Africa from Europe, yeah? That's what you are. A lot of species.
Yeah, a lot of the herbaceous things, but they're not. These are the species that you see around on the pavements and the sidewalks here, which have evolved. It's another factory. Urbanization and city living over hundreds of years in Europe has produced these.
So you probably have a cheat grass, right?
Cheat grass is very interesting. It has been recorded there, but it's very rare. We have some other species of bromus.
Because you have strong grasses.
Hordiaceous. Our ecosystems seem able to resist invasions of grasses.
Mm. This was actually, I had a slide that I removed in the afternoon because I saw the talk was getting too long, and it showed the most distributed species in terms of in how many regions they occur, most distributed naturalized species. And some of those species occur in half of the world regions. It doesn't mean that they cover half of the globe, but they were recorded in half of the regions all over the world. So, and many of them are European or Eurasian, and so it's very common, and it's also the legacy of the colonial legacy and historical legacy of European empires colonizing other regions, and even now you can tell from the species composition of naturalized plants and animals which region in the New World was colonized by which European empire. This signal is still present.
Thank you.
Hi, I would like to ask, in places which have the colonial legacy of having plants for forestry, and these plants have been there for a really, really long time, and they've become ingrained in the community, is it possible for us to eradicate them and for the community to somehow recover?
I don't think
Well,
so.
I mean, South Africa is where this is happening probably more than anywhere else, because our whole forestry industry is built around exclusively on acacias, pines, and eucalypts, and there's no native alternative. So there's no possibility of ever removing them from the landscape. The only solution is to work with the foresters to ensure that they manage the land that is set aside for the forestry more wisely, and to manage invasions when they occur outside of those areas.
And I think this actually opens another aspect that we didn't mention at all, and it's about the benefits of plant introductions, and we need to realize it's. I think the figure for the United States is that 90% of food resources are from plants that are not native to the United States, or very high number, and some of the developing countries depend for their economies on non-native species and agriculture production. So we in Europe, we have a lot of problems, of course, but still we have a luxury of this approach that we don't depend on eradicating invasion for our lives or so. So it's really complicated, which doesn't mean, it's. Again, it's the matter of opinion. Opinions differ, but you cannot really weigh impact and eradication and extinction against the benefits that are provided by other, because some of these values are very difficult to compare.
I think a really important thing to add to this is that the benefits, the ratio of the benefits to impact is not static. It changes over time. In South Africa, we got huge problems with trees called mesquite, prosopis. They were introduced to provide food for livestock and shade in arid areas, and they were widely planted. And for more than 80 years, they served that benefit. They produced that benefit with no noticeable impacts, but only when they began to spread widely and began to have an impact on biodiversity and even on livestock because they became so dense that the animals couldn't even move through them. And then the impacts outweigh the benefits, but it's too late to manage them then. The problem is so huge that there's no management option that actually works very well.
Mm. And also, if it comes to economic costs, economic impacts, it opens completely different kind of worms. Because we didn't mention it here. There is a study that estimated the costs from animal invasions in the last 40 years at $1.3 trillion. So it's really a lot of money.
some questions on Slido. I will ask, this one is a little bit philosophical maybe. People often argue that the worst invasive species in the world is human. Does this answer collide with the definition of biological invasions? What do you think?
I just want to introduce Peter's answer. I've known Peter for many years. Our most widely cited, or at least my most widely cited paper here, in which he's an author as well, is about definitions. So we've said many times in our career that we have spent much too much time on definitions. But I will hand over to you.
I think it's difficult to. I don't know if you can be the cause and the consequence of the process at the same time. This is a different story, of course. It's because invasions are defined as translocation of species by humans, which actually exclude humans from this. And I mean, it relates to the philosophical question, and I think it's again the matter of opinion whether humans are part of nature. I don't think they are part of nature no longer. So they have to care about nature. We are part of the world, of the organisms living on the planet, but hardly part of nature, in my opinion.
I think just to follow on from that, I would say humans are not biological invasions, and they shouldn't be studied in that field, because invasive species are by definition species that have been transported by something outside of the area, so it leaves their natural enemies behind, which is and humans have not done that. Humans have moved around the world, range expansion, but they've carried along all their natural enemies with them and have been able to overcome them. So the humans are a remarkable species whose impact needs to be studied, but not using the framework of invasions, I would say.
But definitely the most successful species on the planet, right?
Thank you. There's a question. Please wait for the microphone.
What is the reason for the natural forestlessness of South Africa, and why those processes don't work on those new trees?
That's a good question. I need a beer to answer that. No, that is something that many ecologists over many years have been trying to find an explanation without much success. But if you have a look at those Mediterranean type shrublands that I showed you an image of, exactly the same, or not exactly, similar soils with similar rainfall in Australia, with a roughly similar evolutionary history, have got huge eucalypt forest. To just provide a very short answer, I think it was an accident of biogeography that the southern part of Africa is an island removed from the other parts of Africa by soils and mountains and things. We never got through natural dispersal or range expansion anything that works like a pine or like a eucalypt. Our trees are not able to reproduce explosively after fire, store seeds in the soil, and build up huge reserves like that. But that's a good question.
Is there somebody has the last question? If not, I will ask the last question from Slido again. If you look back at the time when you started studying biological invasions and imagined where it can lead, does the current situation exceed your expectation? Or are things better or worse than you imagined?
It's hard to say because when we started to study, it was a very long time ago. The level of information, the knowledge, so the basis you could use to make the predictions and think about how it's gonna look was incomparably low compared to what we know now and how the knowledge improved. So I don't think I was thinking this way, what's going to be 30 years from now, because at that time I didn't believe that one day I will be 60, that it can happen. So. And you? What did you imagine?
Well, I think as Petr and I've been here for a year, and I sit in the same office as Petr most days. And we often speak about things that are going on, new publications that come out in the field. There's still a lot of unknowns or amazing things happening that is changing the possibilities for invasion into the future and options for potentially managing them. So it's becoming an ever more exciting field, I think, and from when we began, now when we began, it was largely studied from a biological and ecological perspective. Now, the field of invasion science involves much more economics and ethics and sociology and law even and philosophy. So it's becoming a much bigger field and, in a sense, more exciting.
And also papers or the predictions what was going to happen actually started so long time ago that some of them are approaching the time for which the dates for which the predictions were made. So soon it will be possible to see how the predictions were right or wrong, because as the famous sentence, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So we'll see whether some were really useful.
So thank you for answering the questions, and thank you for coming today. Thank you all also for watching this talk, and I hope you enjoyed the presentations. Now we will conclude the official part of the event, and if you want both our guests and our audience, you can stay for have a beer or wine and talk with us and each other. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.